is, as you can see, with us already. I will introduce her to you, but before this, I would request our principal, Professor Muhammad Riaz, to kindly inaugurate the series and to, welcome our students and welcome our speaker. Over to you, Riaz.
Thank you, Basu. Good evening, everybody present here today. Our very, very special speaker for today, Professor Pushpinder Syal, Dr. S.M. Yahya Ibrahim, all faculty members, and my dear students. As the head of the institution, it is my extreme pride, privilege, and honor to welcome Professor Pushpinder Syal, Department of English and Cultural Studies, Punjab University, Chandigarh, who is the scholar of English literature and admired and loved by all academicians. Her presence today amongst us is a matter of immense pride, not only for the Department of English, but also for Karim City College, for Jamshedpur, and for Jharkhand as a whole. Her sharing of knowledge and wisdom with our participants is highly fortunate on our part and shall help to inspire them a lot in their journey as a scholar of a student of English literature. I appreciate the initiative taken by the Department of English for organizing a 30 hours online certificate course where the students and research scholars will get an opportunity to enhance their knowledge on renaissance from the resource persons of the national and international repute in the next 15 days. I am thankful to all the faculty members of English department who are striving hard in order to conduct this certificate course. Thank you very much to all.
Thank you for your kind words, and we really hope that we have an enriching 15 days ahead and to inaugurate these wonderful series and the wealth of information that it's likely to bring to our students. Introduce to everyone Professor Pushpinder Syal, who of course needs no introduction. She is a poet, fiction writer, critic, academic, who has retired and is re-employed in the Department of English and Cultural Studies, Punjab University. No one would like a teacher like her to leave. And she has, of course, written numerous books, articles. Her areas of interest are post-colonial writing. She was awarded the Commonwealth Academic Staff Fellowship, the Charles Wallace Trust Fellowship, the Australia-India Council Fellowship. She has delivered lectures at numerous academic staff colleges for refresher and orientation courses. She's on the advisory board of many, many universities. She has been responsible for drafting many, many syllabi. And we are very, very privileged that she has consented to begin this very important period for us, because if we look at modernism, today we realize that modernism comes from the Renaissance and how, the ideas of the Renaissance led to long-term shifts in various dimensions of thought. So this is a topic which is very rich in its interdisciplinarity, and we believe that Professor Syal will be able to do complete justice to it. Over to you, Pushpinder, ma'am.
Thank you. Am I audible to everyone?
Yes, ma'am. You're audible and you're visible, and your PPT is with us. If you would like me to share my screen, I can do that.
Yes. Yes. I'll be asking you from time to time to just put it on, and say maybe in a few minutes after I introduce the topic, we can have the first slide, and then I'll just talk you through some of those slides.
Right. Sure, ma'am.
Yeah. So I'll start. Thank you very much for your kind invitation and your kind words of introduction. It's one of the good things about online communication that we are able to connect in this way and in various directions. And one of the saving graces of this terrible time is that we are able to at least communicate in this way with one another, which is really wonderful. Actually, it does keep us in touch with otherwise we would perhaps not have known each other at all. So thank you very much, and I'll start with a general idea about history and historiography. Today, in the 21st century, we look back at the period of Renaissance, what we think of as the Renaissance. But we find that there is a lot of revision that we have to do in our idea, our understanding of what this period was and how it influenced later ages. So what we have to understand is historiography, actually, that how history is written and from what perspective it is written. And that actually then determines how we are going to look at that particular time. Now, it's quite important, I think, to start from this kind of critical idea that that the Renaissance, as we know about it today, here in our location, remember, it's a post-colonial, post-modern situation. And in this time and in this location, we look at those times and how they have been described and how they have come down to us, how that knowledge about that time has come down to us. Now, in that, we have to critically examine as to what knowledge has come to us, through what means, through what intents, for what purposes. So an important part of epistemology is history itself, how history is written, and how different historiographies often clash with one another. So that a certain kind of historiography will mention, for instance, what is happening in those times. For instance, in the time of the Renaissance, people were beginning to write histories based on some of the histories written earlier. There was the influence of Herodotus, Greek historian. There was the influence of Pliny, the Roman historian. But and we have in Florence a person called Leonardo Bruno, and he's one of the first historians of that time. Now, what was the purpose of Bruno? Say a person who's living in that time. So he's not writing a retrospective history. He's writing about the Florence of his time. And what is his purpose in writing about or describing the Florence of his time? His purpose is to build up the idea of Florence as a kind of a center of art and of culture and of a great deal of activity, architecture, and so many other things that made Florence great in that time. And so it's part of the building up of a kind of a view of the world which is based in that society. And the purpose of the historian is to give us a kind of a picture of that society, a very detailed picture of that society in the history of Florence, supported, as you know, by the Medicis, because the Medicis were influential in supporting a whole lot of the enterprises that flourished during in Florence and in Milan during this time, during the time of the Renaissance. So there is that kind of history. Then there is another kind of history which is written in retrospect by people later on, and they may look at the sources that they have, and then they would try to see what kind of picture they can build up of those times. So that again, that history will also have an ideology. It will also have a purpose. It can be a purpose of trying to show that Renaissance Europe is actually the center of all civilization, and that it is a remarkable kind of flowering of of thought, and which it was. But the way it is written about is to show that nothing like that, existed anywhere else. Whereas, as we know, that it is this sort of history actually pertains specifically to Europe, and that it ignores the vast civilizational context of the other lands around the Mediterranean. And this kind of a bend towards a Eurocentric view of the universe, you could say, of civilization, is propounded by such histories, and we take them, at face value. We have been studying them. For example, when I was a student, we used to be told to read Ligui and Kazamia, History of English Literature. And irony being that history of the most authoritarian history of English literature being written by French historians, French literary historians. Ligui was French, so was Kazamia. So and we were people preparing for the civil services would swear by, who took literature as their subject, would swear by the text of Ligui and Kazamia. And indeed, one could say that the sections of that history of literature by Ligui and Kazamia are very, very well written, and they give a very comprehensive view of the thinking at the time of the Renaissance, as well as the literary achievements and the developments which took place at that time. Very, very well described in great detail. So still it is worth going back to see how it is visualized, how it is presented, this kind of a building up of literary history. But we must always remember, as Indians also, we must always remember, and our Indian students who are also world students, international students, that we must remember that we have to look at it as a particular kind of way of presenting a time, a period, and a literary history to us. We are the receivers, and to make us think in very, very high terms, of those times, as if there was nothing wrong going on at that time, or there wasn't anything problematic about it, there was nothing contradictory about it. But history is a mess of contradictions. The more you read the different versions of a particular time, the particular kind of period, we find that there are so many contradictory things happening at that time. So on one hand, if we say that Renaissance was a time of flowering, of rebirth, of flowering, etc., that is a very eulogistic way of talking about it. And it was also a time of great religious conflict. It was also a time of a lot of suppression, a lot of executions in the name of religion, and the scientists, the scientific minds were also being oppressed, and there was a lot of political conflict between the powers that had emerged on the European scene. And there was obviously, as we know, that in the Middle Ages the Crusades had taken place, and after that the Ottoman Empire had risen, and the Ottoman Empire had very quickly taken over many vast areas of the central part of the world, which was called the cradle of civilization, so to speak. And so they had overcome the entire area. The Turks dominated the entire area, and it was, you could say, it was a kind of an Islamic victory for the Ottoman Empire having spread all over this part of the world. And the aim of the Ottomans was also to spread Europe. And one of the main things was their conquest of the city called Constantinople, which is modern day Istanbul. So if we can just have a look at the slides, the dates are given over there, and perhaps having the dates over there. Could you please put up the first slide? Yeah, the first one. Yes. Second after this. Yes. So, so if we look at this, my purpose in putting these dates, I don't want to oppress you with dates, but my purpose in putting up these dates is firstly to show that that the Renaissance is not contained within a century or 2 centuries, that it spreads over a period of several centuries, and that there is a continuity between sorry, the Middle Ages and what is called the Renaissance time. You see, it's not that there was an abrupt departure from the ideas that were around in the Middle Ages to those of Renaissance ideas. There was a gradual transition, and there is a lot of continuity. Many things from the Middle Ages persisted during the later part of the Renaissance also, that is up till the 17th century and Enlightenment period. So, so there is this continuity. We cannot ignore the idea that there is in history that, you know, dates are a bit arbitrary in that sense, because there is a lot of continuity, a lot of movement from one time to another time, and all the events that are happening with the people, you know, overlapping the lives of the leading exponents of that time, overlapping. So as the life of Erasmus, for instance, overlapped with Martin Luther, you know. So that's why I put these dates over here to tell us that actually the seeds of Renaissance go back even before 1350, you might say. You know, they go back to even people like Abelard. Abelard was a French thinker, logician, scholastic, and a philosopher of language. And at that time, you know, in the 12th century even, there were universities that had been established. A little bit, I could say, on the establishment of the universities, that the monasteries were the first, you could say they were the first types of universities, because there was a lot of scholarship, lot of learning in those places, in the monasteries. A lot of study of logic, grammar, rhetoric, law even, along with, of course, theology, which was the main thing. So, so that from the monasteries, universities were born. So we have the university in Paris, and then we have the establishment of Oxford and Cambridge. So these were the universities, and they actually extended the purpose of the church. You see, the universities were not a departure from theology or from the church doctrines. The universities were actually filled with Christian theologians, you know, and that they were actually supporting the laws and the dogmas and the discourses of the church in the Latin language. The universities were organized originally as guilds. They were guilds, and they were supported by rich establishments like the Catholic Church, etc. And but some were secular also, particularly in Italy. So so we have Abelard, and then we have other early thinkers, and then we look at Petrarch, for instance. Now, Petrarch is a person who brought in some of those, and this is before the fall of Constantinople. If you look at the sequence of dates over here, Petrarch is more than a century before Constantinople happened. And Petrarch is credited with discovering Cicero and several other important Roman Latin writers, and popularizing them. So, so you can see that that movement has started even before what is called the fall of Constantinople, which initiated the Renaissance, because Greek scholars left Constantinople and they traveled towards Italy, and then they went and took their books with them, etc. Yes, that did happen, but before that also, a lot of movement was going on. It's not that things were just at a standstill. There was a lot of movement in Italy, with writers like Petrarch and also Boccaccio's Decameron. Some of the earliest, you can say Decameron is one of the earliest novels to be written, you know. So that was in, you could say, pre-Renaissance Italy. And then, of course, if you see the overlapping of these dates, you can see that 15th century, a lot of things happening, and we have the main one very, very important event which completely sort of changed the world, and that was, of course, Gutenberg, the printing press. Now, it's very important to examine, maybe in further lectures there will be more discussion on that, examining the difference made by the coming of printing, and of the setting of type, that is the block printing, the setting in types, the coming of fonts, as we say so today. And of course, I mean, this revolution in print was a sort of revolution that today we have in the coming of internet. I mean, after so many centuries, we have another revolution. Well, printing press was also the same kind of revolutionary event, because from the printing press we have then the widespread circulation of books. Even the notion of book, even the idea of book came at that time. So here there is a summarization of some of the events. Abelard, establishment of universities, growth of Florence, and Petrarch, Erasmus. Well, if we talk about Erasmus, Erasmus is one of the modern thinkers. Since we're talking about influence of modernity, Erasmus is one of the reformers of that time. He's not as radical as Martin Luther. In fact, he had disagreements with Martin Luther because he felt that one should not be so radical as to break down everything, and the structures, but also to look at the things from the past which are worth knowing and worth understanding. So a very important figure at the time of the Renaissance, and almost at the same time, if you look at the previous slide, it's the same time as Martin Luther, around the same time as Martin Luther. So coming back to the role of the printing press. Now, print actually has, is able to reach a lot of people, and the printing press made it possible to bring out so many versions of authoritative texts, of the new texts, basically in Latin, French, and the more privileged kind of version of Italian, which was Tuscan. So now we must understand that, of course, it is said that the printing press brings about democratization. The printing press is able to spread knowledge to so many more people and lay the foundations of a democratic system, or a system where knowledge is widely dispersed amongst a large number of people. But you see, that is another of the myths that sometimes we have. We like to sustain such myths. If you look at it carefully, it works both ways. You see, it is a double-edged sword. So while on one hand a lot of knowledge does get disseminated through the availability of what are called books, which are now bound rather than rather than loose manuscripts or loosely bound. The idea, the very notion of a book, emerges at this time. And so that no doubt is true, but we must also see that it also led to a kind of a glorification of certain European languages like Latin and subsequently French, um, which meant that there was a privileging of the printed text over that of the oral knowledge. Number one. So, firstly, that the oral wisdom or the oral knowledge was put in the back, and the printed text came forward as the dominant mode of communication. Just like today we worry that the internet or other media may displace the book, displace the printed word. At that time, the printed word displaced the oral. So now what happens then? What happens is that the printed text becomes very authoritative, and then it begins to influence people's minds, and it begins to be regarded as the only dominant way of presenting knowledge. So remember that we must think about the printing press, emergence of printing press and of books, in consonance with the expansion of the trade and colonization. So as colonization gets widespread, so the books from Europe go to other parts of the world, and it is in the form of the printed text. So the printed texts from Europe begin to dominate the other cultures. And so there is a power that then is gained by privileging of the printed text and spreading it through the agency of ships going around the world. So now what does that do? What that does is to suppress the other language systems which are there in other parts of the world. Considering that the Roman script, the Roman font in which the printing press had started to kind of use, which they had started to use in the printing of books, is the widespread one, and the other scripts, it may be Arabic, it may be South American, it may be so many other scripts in other parts of the world, are getting less importance, and some are actually being suppressed. And I'm taking a lot of this information from a book which I will mention in the last slide. I've got the list over there of books and the references are there. I happened to listen to Walter Mignolo, Mignolo, and read his book called The Darker Side of the Renaissance. Now, in The Darker Side of the Renaissance, Mignolo describes the effect that colonization had in suppressing the knowledge systems of the worlds that they went to. So we have Vasco da Gama and we have Christopher Columbus. And then we have many other explorers who went to the islands of the Caribbean and then to the Central America, Mexico, south of Mexico, and places where there were flourishing civilizations who had pictographic script, so that their language was in pictures, their script was different from that of European scripts. But that was seen by the European explorers and conquerors as a devil's work, that this script has these scripts have no value, and huge fires were burnt of destroying the knowledge of the Aztecs and the Mayans and other civilizations which were there in that part of the world, so that we don't have that kind of a continuity in those areas, that we have, and we look back at the Renaissance and we say, wow, we are all products of the Renaissance. We own up to it. We imagine that, that was for us. That was not for us. That was for themselves. The Europe that they were building was for themselves and not for the other parts of the world whom they totally ignored or suppressed. Now, even in Europe at that time, it wasn't as though that everybody was thinking in the same way. I do want to touch upon some of the main ideas of the Renaissance with this kind of critical standpoint, which I have been trying to develop over the last half an hour. It's a time of intense conflict of ideas, and one of the main conflicts is a religious conflict. Now, for one thing, we can say that religion never ceased to have importance even in the Renaissance. Now, we have been told in a very monolithic kind of an explanation that Renaissance meant the dawn of humanism. It meant a new secular world, scientific world, etc., etc., and that in the Renaissance, the Christian religion or religion ceased to have much importance. Not so, not so, not so at all, not even till today. And the thing was that, in fact, religious conflict, if anything, increased. Why? Because of the loosening of certain prior structures. We had questioners like Martin Luther. And the loosening of the structures of the church meant that there was an equal opposition from the church side. There was an equal opposition from the Catholic against the Reformation of Martin Luther. And so, in one part, you will find Catholics being burnt because they were considered to be, followers of bad practices, superstitious practices following the Roman Church. In another part of Europe, or a few years later, you would find Protestants being burnt because they dared to, they were heretics. Now, heretics had been burnt since the 12th century. They were burnt because they were supposed to be opposing the church. So these practices continued and well into the Renaissance, and therefore we cannot say that it was a time of great humanism in the sense that everybody was aware of human and moral values all of a sudden. So these are some of the contradictions. We have the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition was a kind of a court, religious court, which was put up in order to bring to trial anyone who contested any idea of the church. Because, as you know, Spain was highly Catholic, and Germany, however, because Martin Luther is from Germany, so we find that in that part, the Protestantism arose, whereas Catholicism continued to hold sway in places like Spain. So the king and queen of Spain and all, they were all during the time of Columbus and after also were staunch Catholics. So this colonization also was supported by Catholic rulers, by kings who wanted to increase their power and were expanding their trade. Also because, you see, the Istanbul had been, it wasn't called in Istanbul then. It only got this name later, much later, early 20th century, when Ottoman Empire came to an end. But the fallout of that was that the Ottomans had control over the major trade routes that had dominated the trade and economics of the world, of that part of the world at that time. So on the Silk Roads that travelers came, traders came, they spread into the Eurasia, the westernmost part of Asia, and then into Europe. And most of the trade then found its way into, most of the goods found their way into Italy and other places in Europe. So those trade routes got blocked off by the victory of the Turkish Ottoman Empire, because they blocked off the trade routes for Europe. And so the European powers had to find out alternative trade routes. And so they desperately began to look for ways to go to the eastern part of the world from where they wanted their trade, and also to explore other areas from where they could get all their goods. So this is what led to the expansion of trade. So we must take the Renaissance as a economic and trade development also, because economics and trade influence the cultural movements very much. And we can't ignore the factors and circumstances that led to the establishment of certain sorts of certain kinds of cultures in Europe. We might say that, look, the coming of slavery. Now, slavery had been there for a long time, of course. It had been there in the time of the Romans and the time of the Greeks also. Now, that's another way in which we have to look at the Greek and the Roman civilizations also. Because of the Renaissance, we started to glorify the Greek and Roman civilizations also. Because the Renaissance presented such a great picture of a revival of the great ideas of the Greeks and the Romans. So we bought that wholesale. And obviously, slavery, exploitation, colonization was very much there in the Greek and in the Roman times. And so actually, the Renaissance developments are only echoing, or they are only following in continuity the same practices that were followed by those earlier civilizations. Although when we read them, we eulogize the works of the Romans and the Greeks as great works of philosophy, etc., which they are. But then if we look at the social, economic, and political conditions of all these times, then we find that those do not really reflect those philosophies as such. So we have to see that what the Renaissance tells us, that Renaissance is also the birth of slavery because of racism of a certain kind. Because the more these people traveled on their ships to Africa and South American coasts and all that, the more they saw that the people over there who were very civilized, but according to Europeans, those people were just foolish, and they were innocent people, and they were savages, etc. And they said that, well, these people will make very good servants. They will do our bidding for us. So let's take them let's capture them and take them as our slaves. So how do you reconcile the birth of humanism with the birth of slavery or renewal of slavery? So when we say Renaissance is a rebirth of what? Rebirth of slavery, rebirth of exploitation. So we have to look at, both the conflicts, religious conflicts which are inside Europe, happening inside Europe, and also the whole kind of colonization enterprise, which is quite central to Renaissance, and this is what Mignolo opens our eyes to. There are other studies also of revisionist studies of Renaissance, which I'd like to ask you to look at, because then that in a way completes the picture. It tells us a bit more about that period of history than we knew earlier. So we could say then that if we look at what is Renaissance, let's go away from the idea that it is just a flowering or a rebirth or a great, of course, it is an expansion of knowledge. That I'll just come to. But either the word Renaissance is a misnomer for the kind of changes that were taking place in Europe. That it wasn't just Renaissance happening, it was a lot of continuity with the past that was also going on, and building a base for Eurocentric domination of the world. and an exploitation or in opposition to older civilizations in other parts of the world. And or that we can just use the term Renaissance as just a very narrowly as a resurgence of classical art and culture in Europe after Christian influences waned. So if we take a narrow definition, then we can say, well, it's just a movement in of art and culture, and which becomes visible, and it's a trend towards secular and humanistic, as different from what it was earlier, but that we cannot say it is a radical departure from the worldview that was there earlier. And I'll try and prove this by some examples. So there was still plenty of Christian iconography around. All of Russia, for instance, was Orthodox, Greek Orthodox Church. So there was Christianity established itself in Russia, and then we have a lot of areas of Catholic influence. We know that in England there were intense struggles between Catholic and Protestant monarchs, and historians may have projected it as a relief from dark ages into the light or some such. But even if some historians have projected it as such, it is not a sudden transformation of this kind. And that Catholic contestations and counter Catholicism or counter Reformation also took place. So if we look at these sorts of developments within Europe, and then going side by side with colonization, so this establishes an imperialist and colonialist kind of civilization, which sometimes is not the kind of idea that is sold to us in the name of Renaissance. So, but let me just go to some of the ideas that were there. Can we have the next slide? In this slide, we can look at some of the next part, which is the later Renaissance. So, of course, we have now, so I've just divided these slides into two parts. One is the earlier developments and then the later ones. Now, as we can see over here, there is a significant change if we look at the people who dominated the later Renaissance. So we have here, first of all, the growth of science. And despite a lot of suppression, despite a lot of torture and cross-examination and Spanish Inquisition, etc., we have people like Bruno, Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo. Not to mention many others, but these are the main scientists of that time. And before them, we have what is called the beginning of humanism in Mirandola, Pico, whose 1493 document on oration on the dignity of man is seen as one of the first introductions to humanism. And then, of course, later we have Descartes and, of course, Spinoza and others. But I want to draw particular attention to Francis Bacon, because students of English literature would know about Francis Bacon, but often we just see some of the essays written by Francis Bacon and not perhaps the kind of contribution that he made to the establishment of a certain episteme, establishment of a certain methodology of study, which had a lot of influence on education. How the university education or the college education is going to be organized, into what disciplines, into what fields it should be organized, etc. All this comes from Bacon's Advancement of Learning, 1605, and Novum Organum, 1620. Now, some of the main things about Bacon was his again, his emphasis on empiricism. You see, now empiricism comes up as one of the dominant modes. What is empiricism? It is experiential, experimental, observational methodology. That is, we get knowledge through experience. We get knowledge through experimentation. Observation of facts and the particulars, attention to specifics and particulars rather than theorizing just in a vacuum. So Bacon is responsible for this turn towards empiricism and the division of poetry, logic, of knowledge into these areas of he says that history deals with memory, and poetry deals with imagination, and philosophy deals with reason. And here also we have to look at the twin epistemological methods. One is reason and one is empiricism, right? So here, for instance, in Descartes, we would find rationalism, reason, because according to Descartes, the best way we can get knowledge is to doubt, to ask questions, and not to take anything for granted. And that indeed is something that is made a foundation of philosophy, made into a foundation. So that indeed is one of the foundational precepts. And I must mention that during the Renaissance, the influence of Plato is quite tremendous, because Platonic thought influenced Renaissance thinkers in a major way. But on the other side, we have Francis Bacon and we have Hobbes. Now, these thinkers emphasize empiricism, and they emphasize social and political order and how a political organization should take place. In a way, Hobbes and Machiavelli, these are thinkers who establish a sort of authoritarian, a justification for social order in authoritarian rule, in a way that you see that order can come about only if there is a certain degree of ascendancy of the prince, you could say, or of the ruler. So these are various ideas at that time, and they're very contradictory, because on one hand we have the spread of humanism, in a sense that human beings are the center of the world, and all human beings have abilities, great abilities. At the same time, there is also this differentiation between greater and lesser human beings, or people from different classes. So these are certain things that we must keep in mind when thinking about Renaissance. Let me just go on to the next slide to just show you some of the dominant ideas. Can we have the next slide, please? Next one. Yes. So now let's look at some of these things. I've already mentioned that we must question just the episteme. Yes, we must question this idea of rebirth, rediscovery, revival, flowering, etc. Why? Why should we question that? Because these are just adjectives that we use, to paint Renaissance in a sort of a non-problematic way, a non-problematic light, and to just show that everything was wonderful. But actually, different histories, historiography shows us a great deal of number of different things that were happening, and I've referred to the darker side of the Renaissance. So now let us also look at the dominant ideas. Now, humanism. What was the humanism? Humanism looked at what man, the perfect man. Remember, woman has no place in this system. Okay, so it's all man. And they might say that, oh, man includes woman. But certainly in none of that thinking do we have any consideration of what women might have thought or done during that period. In fact, any women who thought radically were immediately burnt as witches. And for instance, Johannes Kepler, the great astronomer, his mother was very learned, and she was ostracized and isolated and condemned as a witch, and she was brought to trial. So Kepler's mother, right? So so this is, anyway, that is an aside on women, you know, on the erasure of women. But when we come to this humanism, so-called humanism, well, it's manism, not humanism. The perfect man. Now, obviously, we are told that yes, earlier the center was God. Christian theology in the Middle Ages, everything was directed towards the faith and belief in God as the center of the universe and as the giver of all things. But now it became more obvious that human beings were to be the controllers of their destiny. They are the center of the universe, and that, you know, they are part of nature that is controllable, you know, that we can control. And Descartes also said that certainty is possible. We can be certain about things. We can find out things about nature. Who can find out? Human beings. Man is able to discover nature. Man is able to explore the secrets of nature. And indeed, it is so, because this is a time when we have marvelous sort of expansion of study of nature. And the slide shows the different areas, some of the different areas. It's not comprehensive, but some of the areas in which the study of nature took huge leaps. Science and mathematics, astronomy, for instance. And so a view of the larger universe, of the macrocosm, the planetary system, the solar system, etc., all that became much larger. And it was all built on mathematics. All these thinkers, Descartes and others, they were all, right from Erasmus onwards, they were believers in mathematical science, you know, in logic, in mathematical science. But also anatomy, you see, parallel with the macrocosm, with knowing the larger universe, is also knowing the smaller universe, the universe of the human body. And in the human body, we have the development of Vescalius, who was the anatomist, great anatomist of the time, and Leonardo da Vinci learned from him. And great emphasis on anatomy, on knowing the human body, on looking at what we have is a sort of a structural organization of the human system. And around this time, there was also the discovery of so many of the systems inside the human body. For instance, the circulation of blood. Though I must mention that it's not that these ideas made a radical difference entirely and immediately on the thinking of all the people. You know that well into the 17th century, Ben Jonson, Every Man in His Humor, or even in Shakespeare, we find theory of humors is still there. Idea of the humors, the four humors, etc., is still there. So it's not that we have kind of seen a radical, complete transformation of the idea of how human systems work, or of medicine. I mean, leeches were used right up till the modern times for taking out blood from the body as a form of treatment. So it's not that, that suddenly Europe became all modern and enlightened, and all modern medicine became acceptable. Even for a long time, it was not so. So then, yeah, you see the ideas, that idea of genius. Now, you see, when you come to man, you'll find that, yes, I mean, individuality grows. That on one hand, there is the social order, and on the other hand, the individuals have freedom to develop their potential. You know, the idea of freedom that comes from some of the Greek literature, the potential, the stands out, and the individual freedom leads to the idea of genius. Now, today we are kind of pretty much sure about, we have IQ test and this and that, and we value genius. We say, oh, such and such kind of person would be a genius. Where did the idea of genius come from? The idea of genius came from the idea of certain exceptional individuals who were capable of being almost like a god. And it comes from the idea of hero, right from the earlier times, that the hero is some person of exceptional stature, exceptional ability. And that is why in Shakespeare's tragedies, for instance, we have these larger than life figures who embody the idea of hero. But in the Renaissance philosophy, it is a little different from how Shakespeare presents it, that in the Renaissance philosophy, it is a bit like the perfect man. And a greater exemplification of that is found in Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, because Dr. Faustus is the exemplary of the perfect man, or aspiration to be the perfect man, and the Renaissance aspiration to be perfect in every respect, to have all knowledge, to have all power, to have all wealth, to have all beauty, total dominance over the world. That is the aspiration. Now, this is a huge kind of ambition, and no wonder the believers in the religious believers felt that there was a travesty of God's divine ordain in the world. That how come that man can be so big as to challenge God? And that is precisely the dilemma we find in Dr. Faustus, because we find that we have this overreacher. This Overreacher is the title of a book that I read when I was a student by Harry Levin. And the Overreacher is an Icarus-like figure. The myth of Icarus represents the Renaissance man, that Icarus was so ambitious and he wanted to fly. And so he made wings, and he made wings of wax, etc., put together feathers and made huge wings, and took off. And he flew, but he was very ambitious, so he wanted to fly higher and higher and go closer to the sun. And as he went closer to the sun, the heat of the sun melted the wax on the wings, and he fell and he drowned in the sea. So that is the overreacher. The overreacher meaning that that hubris will happen, as was in the Greeks, and as we see in Shakespeare also, and in Marlowe, that we have this inordinate ambition, which will lead to disaster. So this is how the poets and the literary writers actually critiqued it. In fact, if I may give a little bit of an example from King Lear, that some of the old and the new ideas clashing, which they clash in Shakespeare a lot. Shakespeare himself steps aside to allow his characters to speak in different voices of the dominant thinking of that time. So there is a dialogue between Gloucester and his illegitimate son Edmund in King Lear. And significantly, it is right in the beginning of the play, Act 1, Scene 2, and it is just after Lear does his foolish acts and he, makes his decision to divide his kingdom. So Gloucester says, he says, I'm quoting, "These late eclipses of the moon and the sun are good to us." So he's a believer in the astrology. He's a believer in the fact that it's the stars which dominate us. He says that though the wisdom of nature can reason, it does, and thus yet nature finds itself scourged by the sequent effects. Love cools, friendship falls off, brothers divide, in cities mutinies, in countries discord, in palaces treason, and the bond cracked between son and father. The king falls from the best of our time. Machinations, hollowness, treachery, and all ruinous disorders follow us disquietly to our graves. He says the time is such that these bad things are happening. And because it's the stars that rules us, we are being controlled by the heavens. Edmund says, this is the excellent foppery of the world. that when we are sick in fortune, often the surfeits of our own behavior, we make guilty of our disasters the sun, the moon, and the stars, as if we were villains out of necessity, fools by heavenly compulsion, knaves, thieves, and traitors by spherical predominance, drunkards, liars, and adulterers, uh, enforced obedience of planetary influence, and all that we are evil in by a divine thrusting on. An admirable evasion of whoremaster man to lay his goatish disposition on the charge of a star. So this shows the conflict between certain new beliefs and old beliefs and how these are juxtaposed. But one very important development is that in geography, you know, the mapping of the world, the cartography, how carta is a chart, is a word for chart, how the maps of the world are being drawn, and how cartography makes this part of the world, the center, very well charted out, and other parts subservient to whichever country or whichever power happens to dominate them. And now this is in consonance with the discovery of the Americas, north and south, and what effect that has. Because I'm quoting Mignolo here, that quote, one of the chief historical markers of the Renaissance is the discovery and colonization of the continent of the New World, and it continued till the carving up of African, Asian, and Australian territories between European powers. So that all that continued despite enlightenment, despite rationalism, despite everything, this continued till the end of World War II, where many countries were, the spoils were divided between these different European powers: Dutch parts of Africa, French parts of Africa, Belgian parts, English, French, and so on and so forth. So geography becomes that kind of, on one hand, yes, we get to know the world much better, and the methodology of surveying different parts of the world which were not known, and extraordinary ways in which these discoveries were made, or you could say this mapping was done. It of course gives us a great deal of sense of wonder at human ingenuity and human powers. And for that, I can have no greater example to give you than Leonardo da Vinci. Now, Leonardo da Vinci is a thinker whom I myself, a thinker, not just a thinker, but an artist, sculptor, anatomist, painter, and explorer in thought. If we can have that drawing, please, if we can have that that picture. Yes. Now, this picture, Vitruvian Man. Vitruvian Man is a sketch out of many sketches in that we find in Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks. Vitruvian Man is from Vitruvius, who was a great architect of that time. And the picture of Vitruvian Man shows us about the architectural location of human body in the world. So the measurement of the arms and legs of the human body are so perfect that they are both part of a square, as you can see, and they also touch a circle, which is the outer part. And if you were to measure, the man's navel is the exact center of that circle. So this was an architectural idea of the centrality of man, a centrality of man in the universe, and of how, if we want to understand nature, we have to understand man. And if we want to understand man, we have to understand nature. By the way, a little aside is that these notebooks of Leonardo are today in the possession of a person called Bill Gates, who paid $40 million, and they are in his possession. Anyway, so So Leonardo wrote these notebooks, and he made all kinds of anatomical studies. For example, the teeth, you know. So he's the first person to have actually detailed the different kinds of teeth, human teeth, and the number and their functions by drawing detailed sketches. He drew detailed sketches of musculature, which Vitruvius also did, you know, of all the nervous system and the muscles, and also you know, how many muscles there are in each part. For instance, in his early paintings, he drew some portraits in which he tried to draw a smile, a person, a lady smiling. And he was studying at that time the movements of the face, the facial, you know, movements, and the sorts of different changes in the face when laughing or smiling or groaning or uttering some pain or something like that. So he would see which muscles are involved in each, and he found that there were hundreds of muscles involved just in a slight movement of the lips. He did this study for years and years, and he did several sketches and paintings of portraits of people with the smile, trying to portray the exact kind of movement of the lips. It is a study of the facial gestures and the facial features that finally culminated in the smile of the Mona Lisa. You know, so it is after a lifetime of studying what exactly happens in the muscles in the face that enigmatic smile of Mona Lisa was produced. I'll quote a little bit from a biography, Walter Jacobson's biography of Leonardo, because Leonardo epitomizes what I might say is kind of the best of the Renaissance in many ways, you know. And so we have, you know, in the notebooks, hundreds of drawings on geology, astronomy, on flow, and like Icarus, but he wasn't like Icarus. He didn't do the foolish thing of making wings out of wax. He drew pictures of flying machines, which were earlier prototypes of aeroplanes. So he did not actually construct wings out of wax and feathers. I'm quoting this from the biography, that his goal was the one that Renaissance thinkers, himself foremost among them, bequeathed to the subsequent ages of science and enlightenment. That is, understanding the causes and effects that rule our cosmos, ranging from the mechanics of our muscles to the movement of the planets, from the flow in our arteries to that in the Earth's rivers. Among the questions it addresses, what causes springs of water to emerge from mountains? Why do valleys exist? What makes the moon shine? How did fossils get onto mountains? What caused water and air to swirl in a vortex? And why is the sky blue? As he embarked on his investigations, Leonardo reached back to the microcosm-macrocosm analogy as his framework. Leonardo writes, the body of the earth, like the bodies of animals, is interwoven with ramifications of veins, which are all joined together and are formed for the nutrition and vivification of this earth and its creatures. And then he said, its flesh is its soil, its bones are the arrangement of the connection of rocks of which are composed. Its cartilage is a porous rock. Its blood is in the veins of waters. The lake, the blood, which is throughout the heart, is the ocean. Its breathing and the increase and decrease of blood through the pulses in the earth is thus. It is the flow and ebb of the sea. So he's looking at the dynamic history of the world, of the earth itself, in which powerful forces are at work and cause it to change. And he says, we might say that the earth has a vegetative soul. And regarding the earth as a living organism, he was inspired to explore the way in which it evolved, how mountains were laced with fossils, how rocks became layers, how rivers cut valleys, and how rugged outcrops eroded. Now, you see, he was also being empirical because he was trying to test it against experience and experiment, constantly doing certain sorts of experiments. Now, that is that there was a unity in nature and there was a variety. Now, if you look at this, you can look at this tremendous Renaissance man, as we like to say. Then how is it that this view of the earth as organic, as a living entity, how did this become, how did this degenerate in subsequent centuries to a sort of an abuse of the vast complexity, unity, and variety that the earth offers, of its evolutionary potential, of its life and energy and its vegetative soul, as Leonardo calls us. That's why in this talk I am focusing a little bit on an individual like Leonardo, because I find that what is best in the Renaissance, what we might regard as something which is a core, is the awareness of this earth that we live in, of its potential, of its vastness, of its variety, and also of the body, and how science can actually help us to understand these things. But how does that deteriorate then into something else? To knowledge is power. So that equation of Descartes perhaps comes in, that we use that knowledge for power, and power, ultimately power over the earth, which is a futile kind of thing, like the overreacher, like Marlowe realized in Dr. Faustus, that power is ultimately worthless. It's not that God will send the devil, or the devil will come and take away a man's soul, as happens in Faustus. But in a way, yes, that is what happens. Man's soul does get taken away when it is not connected to the what Leonardo da Vinci calls the vegetative soul of the earth. So that's why I've emphasized that a little bit. The next slide, please. And I'll be working towards the conclusion now. I wanted to talk about art and literature in particular, because this is, of course, the main aspect of the Renaissance that we are familiar with. And out of these, two countries become the focus. One is Italy and one is England. Italy, because it is the fount of all those earlier, right from the time of Petrarch, Boccaccio, and others, and right up till the 17th century, we have any number of wonderful writers and thinkers, and architects. Have listed them here in this slide somewhere down there. Brunelleschi, architecture; Vesalius, and anatomy; Leonardo da Vinci, painting, sculpture, mechanics, anatomy; Michelangelo, Raphael. Now, all these, I mean, this is like a Nobel. There was no Nobel Prize at that time. Otherwise, all the Nobel Prizes would have gone to Italy only in all these fields. So, so if we look at Italy as the center and of a lot of thought. Also, I want to mention, both in Italy, in the case of Italy, and in England, the role of translation in the development of this knowledge and this art and literature, because from the time of Petrarch, the classical texts were being translated. And if we have the influence of the Greek philosophers like Aristotle and Plato, and the influence of the Romans like Cicero, Tacitus, Seneca, Plutarch, among others, then we see that all this is available through translation. And translation is interesting because by the time these texts, these classical texts, come to England, they are doubly translated. So they undergo double translation. What does that mean? That first, some of the Italian thinkers and writers translated from the original classical texts and were translated into Latin, and then some of the English writers and historians, translators, translated them into English, from the Latin into English. So many of the translations were not from original Greek, though several translators, English translators, knew Greek, and they did from there also. I may mention, of course, you would have heard of Sir Thomas North, who had translated Plutarch's Lives of the Romans, which was a great influence source of Shakespeare's Roman plays. And then we have, quite an interesting person, Justius Lipsius, who an Italian who translated Tacitus and edited and translated in 1574. And then Justius Lipsius's translation comes to a person called Syal in England, who translates Tacitus from Lipsius's translation into English. And this becomes very authoritative. Then there's another person called Field who produces another version of that. And this Tacitus, the Tacitus style, when we talk about Bacon's writings, for instance, the prose style which develops in English is derived from Tacitus, the sort of sentence construction that we see over there. Now, the interesting thing about translation, of course, this double translation phenomena, is that when this kind of double translation takes place, it's also the fact that the whole culture gets translated. So when the Italians translated the classical texts, obviously they put in something of their contemporary understanding into those texts, even though it was in Latin or Italian. And then when the English translators translated those texts into English, they were obviously also adapting. So it's adaptation according to the adapting those texts to fit into the English temperament, an English way of thinking, an English cultural ethos of that time. That is, we could say, the Elizabethan age and the early Jacobean age, when most of the translations took place. In fact, just to give you an idea, 6,000 translations were done during the period from 1473 to 1640, which is say roughly 2 centuries, and that 25% of all printed books were translations of earlier books. So you can see the importance of translation. Perhaps some of you might like to explore that idea further. The Oxford History of Translation Studies is a useful source to refer to for that. So I just wanted to mention that this was a world of translation. This was a world of translation. Everything is being translated into everything else. But one important thing, which is the supremacy of Latin as a knowledge-generating language. Now, you know that the idea that we have of languages are, even in our country, we have that idea of Sanskrit as language of gods, etc., etc. So we have certain ideas about certain languages, and Latin always had this very, very high position. And during the Renaissance, this idea of Latin, or this predominance of Latin, only got more strengthened. It was already strong in the Christian texts, in the Catholic texts during the Middle Ages, but it got even stronger during the Renaissance. So even though there were vernaculars that were in use all over Europe, but Latin was the language in which all this flourishing of knowledge took place. And that knowledge in various areas like science, philosophy, etc., was available in Latin. So Latin came to be known as the prime knowledge-generating language. So that language is considered to be great, which generates knowledge. That begs many questions, of course. Depends upon what kind of knowledge. Is all knowledge science, philosophy, etc., or there are other kinds of knowledge? So we have to question the idea of episteme and of the kind of knowledge that we consider as valuable, as dominant, and as worth having. What kind of knowledge is worth having and what kind of knowledge is not worth having? So now, once we decide that, we create an episteme. And we've created that episteme, and then any language which helps us to further that esteem, to develop that episteme, will be considered a knowledge generating language, you know. So what happened then was that with the coming of with the Reformation, and then with the universities developing, Reformation, and then with trade, with industrialization, Industrial Revolution, it is the fact that, you know, some of the Northern European languages began to be regarded as more important and knowledge generating than some of the other languages, particularly, you know, the vernaculars in Europe, like Castilian, Catalonian, etc., various languages in Spain and in Italy, and Greek. You know, these are no longer now knowledge generating enough. Okay, they may be repositories of an old tradition, but they do not function according to the developments that take place in the industrial world, in furthering the cause of development. So a lot of languages actually get suppressed in this whole generation of different sorts of dominant languages. So naturally, we have to look at the relationships between languages also when we look at Renaissance, and how translations from one language to another automatically privilege that language. So if you're translating from Latin into French, then naturally Latin is already privileged, French also gets privileged into the bargain, and so also with English. So this is how the languages are related to cultural development and literary development. And then, of course, I mean, I've just mentioned some painters. We mustn't forget that other than Italy also, there was a lot of revival of painting. One thing important to say here is that when we look at painting, when we look at art, painting and sculpture, and the churches, now, you see, the Reformation may have taken place, and a lot of churches may have been destroyed also. But if we look at whatever we see today in Florence and in different parts of Italy and in Belgium, in other parts of Europe, we see a lot of churches, cathedrals, etc., containing a huge amount of Christian art. Even, see, Michelangelo is supposed to be the high spirit of Renaissance. But what does he paint in on the Sistine Chapel in Rome? What does he paint? He paints God, you know. So thoroughly sort of a Christian influence is there in painting and sculpture. You only have to go to an art gallery like the Louvre or the National Gallery in London to see how much of the Christian iconography, the view of the world is reflected in these great masterpieces, right up to modern times. So what does that tell us? It tells us of the hold or the grip that religion still has had till today, I mean, till the advent of modern art, etc. And even in that, one may contest that in modern art and literature also, we find behind the scenes and in the subtext, the idea of Christian morality, the idea of that dominant paradigm of thinking is still evident. It's very difficult for a modern writer, be it D.H. Lawrence, or be it Joyce, or be it Conrad, or be it even William Golding or Graham Greene, to get away from that core moral issues that Christianity has given them, the heritage, the Christian heritage has given them. So this is the way in which, you know, the old survives in the new, when we talk of modernity, modernism, etc. And so that is again something that we need to keep in mind, that there are no sort of departures as such. And the beautiful painting that we see is overridden by either, say, the pagan, for instance, Botticelli. Botticelli painted and sculpted Venus, you know, and other figures from among the Greek and Roman mythology, mainly Greek mythology. But then when we look at Michelangelo and Raphael, you could say that they are Christian painters. They are painters who paint who paint the dimensions of religion, who open up that sort of feeling and belief that is inherent in that worldview. So that is beautiful in its own way. But then, of course, we have departures from that. We have the Dutch painters and painters in France, and so it's a very varied view that we have. But certainly during the Renaissance, the painters were, you see, Leonardo da Vinci is a little different, because Leonardo da Vinci has painted the Last Supper, certainly, and his famous portrait of Christ, the Savior. But he's also painted Mona Lisa, and Michelangelo has sculpted David. Which is, you could say, David is an example of Renaissance man portrait, like Vitruvian Man. David is a picture of the ideal Renaissance figure of a man. So the glorification of the human body and the perfection of the human body. So these are some of the main threads that I hoped to put before you today, and a kind of a perspective in which we may start looking at the Renaissance. I'm sure that the lectures that are to come will throw a lot more light on some of these aspects, and that it'll be useful in some way to you. There are some references that I've put on the last slide, which you can have a look at. I did want to talk a little bit more about English literature, but I guess we can deal with that in some other questions. But let's conclude. I'll conclude for now and leave some time for questions. So you can have a look at some of these. You see, the references are not very great, but I just wanted to draw attention to the darker side of the Renaissance, and to an article by David Wallace on carving up time in the world. And I must mention here in passing that one of the important kinds of genres that developed during the Renaissance was travel writing, diaries, and letter writing. In fact, epistolary is linked to epistemic, getting to know something. And what was the main way in which people got to know something was through letters written to one another during the exploration and discoveries. So some people kept records of those letters, and that also became a kind of a history of the experience of people who were going to different parts of the world, who were telling their personal as well as their histories of exploration. All that also became history. So history has many subgenres in it, and some of these developed during the Renaissance as an offshoot of the travel and exploration. So that's why I refer to that. So of course, I mean, you can look at some of the standard encyclopedias. Again, you see, the encyclopedia is also a genre which developed during the Renaissance. The idea of an encyclopedia, the idea of a compendium of knowledge which you could have for reference, even that idea has developed during the Renaissance. It was called the Codex, C-O-D-E-X, Codex. And it meant that a kind of a collection of coded, that means of the printed writing, etc. So these codexes were made. Even Leonardo's notebooks are also like that. They're like the first encyclopedias of that kind. There was a Florentine Codex encyclopedia. So in that vein, we have many such encyclopedias today also. I would say that instead of Wikipedia, which one may not exactly recommend, but you can look at the old Britannica, of course, and you can look at several others. For instance, for philosophy, you can look at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and you will get material on the Renaissance philosophers, some more details on Renaissance philosophers, etc. And then you can also look at Routledge Encyclopedia, and you will find more detail on some of these names that I've mentioned in the talk today. So this is just a very rudimentary kind of a list of references. I'm sure there will be many more references coming up, and you'll get a chance to go through some of these sort of these books. So in concluding, I would like to just go back to the idea of history, that you know, the construction of historical narratives is itself an enunciation, a declaration, and this declaration is itself a point of questioning, the questioning of this construction of the narratives, and who is the what is the location of the speaker and the writer who has constructed these historical narratives, and how the social interactions of a given time get constructed as history, you know. So people who wrote at that time or who traveled at that time, how that gets looked at history, and then how we process it as you know, the receivers of that information. So with that, I'll end and leave it open for discussion and questions.
Thank you, ma'am, for a very, very exhaustive session, a very exhaustive, a very exhilarating session. And you drew attention to the ideas of, you know, episteme and episteme making, which I think is how, and, you know, is the way the Renaissance begins, and is how the students should learn to look at it, that it was a crafting of an entirely new body of knowledge, and the way the knowledge emerged. And of course, as you talk about its shadows and its eclipses also. So thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. And I think that Yahya sir has a few words to say. Over to you,
Yeah.
sir.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you for this very enriching and very knowledgeable session. We are extremely grateful. Bashu, if we can take up questions if there are any, and then we'll go ahead, because time is also...
There are no questions as yet in the chat box, but we are inviting questions from students. If you would like to ask a question, you can unmute. If there is anybody who would like to ask a question, you can maybe unmute and ask. You can also put your questions in the chat box, and we will be taking them. I'm sure the students are spellbound, ma'am, because it was a wonderful journey for us also. A very lucid explanation, and you pointed out to almost all the important things that they need to understand at this stage. They need to take note of. They will go back, I hope, to their history books and take note of what areas that you pointed out, and also benefit from your very rich and diverse references. So I hope that you know, our students learn more through this wonderful session. And the session is open for questions. If students would like to ask a question, they can directly unmute and put forward. If they would like to type their questions in the chat box, they may do that.
Any comments? Any comments also? Any
yes,
comments?
observations also. We can take comments and observations also. Yeah. If you would like to give a feedback to the session, that would also be wonderful. Anybody? Well, I think, ma'am, you have explained almost everything, and there is nothing, you know, that they might doubt.
Ma'am, can I add something? Can I add something?
Yes, surely, Saket.
Sure.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, thank you for letting us know about that. The encyclopedia, the way, you know, you talked about something, that codex. That was something very new to know. That we talk of encyclopedia continuously, and you briefed us so well that even this encyclopedia is there from that Renaissance period. And ma'am, can you suggest few more things, like the language regarding, because I was searching about it. we found something like Mexican, Spanish in different languages. So, as you said, that Latin was a prime knowledge generating part in that era. So, can you talk something on that language of these particular encyclopedias or the ideas of encyclopedias during that era?
Okay, okay. Yeah. So it's interesting that some of these encyclopedias were local in the sense that they didn't bring in everything from the world. That, today we think of an encyclopedia, you look it up alphabetically and you can see, you can get the information. They were specific and local, many of the encyclopedias. That is, that, for instance, the Florentine Codex. The Florentine Codex was a comprehensive encyclopedia of Florence, its history, its architecture, its different places, all the history of the dominant families in the Florentine history, like the Medici's history, how the dynasty went back to earlier times. Therefore, the encyclopedia was a kind of narrower than what today we think of encyclopedia as being. The idea of encyclopedia was narrower. That's what Codex was. That is, that they were that was limited to a certain sort of. But given that, it was very comprehensive. It gave you the entire detail of that. See, today we might say that encyclopedia gives you an overview of a subject, but the local or the specific encyclopedias would give you the specific details pertaining to the history, the flora and fauna, the farming, the occupations, and everything related to that particular city or that particular place. It's a lot of derivation from the older notion of city-state and the location of knowledge and of culture in a specific location. So they gave a good idea of that. So that is a main difference. But one very important thing is that it gave for the first time an idea of how knowledge is to be organized. You see, earlier it was more a question of random compilation of things that we would find in isolated places. Maybe somewhere notebooks were there, somewhere there would be notebooks, somewhere there would be some drawings or sketchbooks, etc. So these things would be isolated and scattered. Now, for the first time, there was this idea of the organization of knowledge, which is very important. It comes right up to the present when Foucault talks about discursive formations, because the discursive formations are precisely the organization of knowledge into certain fields. And it is this organization of knowledge into certain fields that this kind of encyclopedia showed us. So that you would have a treatise on anatomy, let's say, which would be comprehensive. It would be a kind of an encyclopedia of all anatomical details. So that would differentiate. It would be differentiated from another sort of field of knowledge. So we see the emergence of genres then from that they become templates for further traditions. So these formations, these smaller formations, become templates from how from now on a scientific essay is going to be written, how from now on a historical account is going to be written, how from now on a mathematical treatise is to be written. So it becomes a template. So this is why the role of the idea of encyclopedia in the Renaissance is somewhat unique, somewhat different. And today, of course, the meaning of the word has changed a bit. So I guess there would be more on this if we were to discover, the origins of encyclopedias. Yeah, more to discover on this.
Yes, ma'am. Can we trace it to the back to the Indian history as well, ma'am?
Yes, we could do. Do you have some particular text in mind that does it? Well, we do have some of these Megasthenes and some of these, those earlier accounts, and uh, some of the treatises of that time. So Ayurvedic texts, for instance, where you have Encyclopedia of Medicine, you know those we find those in all the cultures. That's why I say that we can't say that only Renaissance had this kind of a knowledge in it. If we look at other cultures, we'll see that this kind of way of organizing knowledge into a particular field, so that we have, so we have a kind of a medical shastra, we have sutras and so on. Now these could be considered as encyclopedia if we want to label it like that. But we can use our own terminology also, and we can say, well, Yoga Sutras are also compilation of knowledge, But obviously there would be differences in different cultures from how that knowledge is organized.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
So there were some other questions also in the chat box.
Yes, ma'am. Most of them are observations, It is, I think, most of them are observations. All of them have wonderfully enjoyed the lecture, and they have referred to the way you have given them, a new perception into the subject. And all of them plan to, go back and read this again. There are still a couple of that just have to sift.
Yeah, I think there were one or two
Yes,
questions.
yes, a couple of questions are still there. Okay, we'll take it, from here. Abhishek says that, can Leonardo da Vinci be said as the person who contributed most to the Renaissance?
I think so. It's my personal feeling, because the thing is that as a child, I saw some of the drawings and pictures, and even he had wonderful sketches and all. So since I am interested, dabbling a little bit in art, so I used to take those pictures and copy them, like draw a sketch based on that. So he has these wonderful drawings of skulls and all that also, and things like that. So I used to sort of look at those sketches and draw them. So from childhood, I kind of was fascinated by this particular figure. I didn't know much about the Renaissance on the whole, because that is something I came to know later on when I did English literature. But as one of those wonderful sort of inspiring figures. And then I read this book by Walter Jacobson, Walter Isaacson. He's a great biographer. He's written a biography of Steve Jobs. He's the one who's written on Benjamin Franklin. So it's a wonderful biography on Leonardo da Vinci, which contains a lot of those illustrations, portraits, and of different stages of Leonardo's life. And one of the very interesting things, one of the very interesting questions that he's concerned with everything. That's what is so important, concerned with each and everything. For instance, he's concerned with, why does a woodpecker, when it pecks its head into the wood, why does it not hurt its head, And then he finds out that actually what happens is that the woodpecker has a very long tongue. And that tongue of his rolls up into his brain to make a cushion to protect him from knocking his head on the wood, and from his brain from being damaged. So things like that. Leonardo's work is full of all these observations. His notebooks have so many observations, written observations, not just sketches. And this sort of fascination with the world. It's like, at that time there wasn't any David Attenborough or wildlife photographers, or these people who went with sophisticated cameras to give us an idea of the species. But I think that Leonardo had a very good idea about the variety and diversity of species, only to be augmented later on by Charles Darwin, who actually then again went on to discover more. So I think, yes, Leonardo, a big favorite of mine. I have no, he may have had some dark sides to his. I mean, see, today they say that, oh, well, he was gay and all that. I don't think being gay is in any way anything, to be remarked on as negative or whatever. But he was the epitome of what we call a genius, in that sense.
Thank you, ma'am. You introduced us to many facets of Leonardo that we would otherwise have missed.
Yeah.
Arsu has a question here from Arsu.
Yeah.
She asks, were the monasteries open for knowledge at that time, or were they mixed with evil or suppression during the Renaissance?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because Erasmus, for instance, moved in between monasteries and or universities. So sometimes when he was in Europe, he was ordained as a monk. And then he went to the monasteries and all that, and he lived as a monk and studied over there. Because the monks were experts in a whole lot of things. They were experts in agriculture, they were experts in winemaking, in cooking, so many areas. And they had a whole life within the monastery. So many of the monks would have been open to new thinking. And Erasmus is an example. And then when they got disheartened with that, or they got disillusioned with the restrictive practices of the monasteries, then they would leave. They would leave the monasteries and they would travel and they would go elsewhere, which is what Erasmus did. And then he came to England and he lived for a long time at Oxford, and in Oxford he was a friend of Sir Thomas More. And Thomas More was a very sort of advanced thinker of his time. But because you see, he was considered to be, I don't know, Henry VIII thought of him as a anti and oppositional. So ultimately, poor Sir Thomas More was executed. But of course, Erasmus escaped from Oxford. He went back to Europe and he lived in Switzerland and places like that, more as a free person. So in other words, you see, the monasteries did have questioning. And towards the end of the Middle Ages, this questioning became more and more intense, because the monks in the monasteries also began to ask questions, and they were also kind of they wanted to assert the boundaries of their faith, the basis of their faith. but ये faith है तो मतलब किस चीज के बेस पे है? अब जैसे Saint Augustine, some of the famous Christian thinkers, Sir Thomas Aquinas, Saint Thomas Aquinas, so these were the monastic thinkers, and they were beginning this idea of not revolting against Christian thinking. See, even in humanism, there are many shades of humanists. Even all the humanists were not against religion. Many of the humanists just wanted to reform the religion. They didn't want to have depart away from religion completely and become agnostics or whatever. But they just wanted to reform the religion and make it better. But of course, if the church detected these kinds of people, then they would punish them severely. So I mean, they were burnt or they were oppressed and so on. So thousands of people were brought to the Spanish Inquisition simply because they were questioning. So that is Spanish Inquisition, and so that's the thing. So yes, I mean, the monasteries are not again some place where there is a lot happening in those monasteries. Maybe a lot hasn't been documented, and maybe unfortunately during the Reformation, when there were lots of monasteries in England also, when Henry VIII brought about his Reformation, and he said all the Catholic monasteries and the teachings of Catholic Church should be abolished. That was a time when a lot of monasteries were burnt, and lots of books were burnt, written by the monks. Lots of books were burnt. Lot of treatises on nature and on theology, on morals, ethics, etc. We don't know about, because these very violent movements, religious movements which took place, actually did a lot of harm, in the sense that much of knowledge was also destroyed during that time. And the burning of the monasteries is a case in point, and that is again one terrible fact of history about how the monasteries were burned, and then the beautiful buildings of the monasteries were taken over by the king and the aristocracy, the aristocrats of that time. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. That was a very, very interesting answer which you offered to our question.
Thank you.
With this, I think we come to the end of the questions that could be asked. But I would like to talk about a very poetic comment that you have. Of course, you have some wonderful admirers here. And among all the comments that, thank you for your wonderful lecture, there's a very poetic comment that says, it's from Devidas Mukherjee, and it says that your explanation, was just like a flow of pure water. So your sentences flowed like pure water. And this was, I think, the best kind of description for today's session, because indeed it seems to be effortlessly from you. And a topic as weighty as the Renaissance was therefore, very lucidly presented to us. Thank you so much for this very wonderful session. And like to call upon Professor Yahya Ibrahim, the head of the department, for his vote of thanks. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you for this very enriching and wonderful session. It was a real beginning for this course, terrible and cherishing beginning for this course. I hope that the participants, as the more they go through those coming lectures, they'll be more able to connect, reconnect, collect, and recollect with your lecture today during the course of those 13, 14 lectures that we have coming up. So thanks on behalf of my college, man. Thanks on behalf of all the teachers of my department. Thank you so much on behalf of all these participants, and thank you so much on behalf of college management also. It was really a very interesting session, and I hope that we'll be meeting time to time, even if virtually in any way, hopefully.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thanks a lot. And
thank you.
Yeah, and participants also thankful.
Yeah. Thanks to the faculty, thanks to you for your appreciation, and it is a good opportunity for us to interact. I hope that in the coming sessions there will be lot of things that will come up, and you will enjoy the entire course. This is one good experience that I'm also looking forward to. I'll be with you in some of the lectures that are coming up. I'd love to listen to what everybody is saying. Dr. Yahya, thank you so much, because we have met on Facebook. We have met on several, when there are some lectures going on, and I notice your participation over there. And it's very heartening to be part of this community where we can share these things. So whenever there's anything, do invite me, do let me know.
Sure, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you to all.
Thank you.
Thank you. The session today comes to an end.